We love stories. Stories inform us, inspire us, and hopefully instigate us to action. Stories are ways that we transmit ethical and morals of a society. Now, for most of us here today, we had movies and television as ways to share those stories. As a young child, I actually used to watch this Lutheran show, Davy and Goliath. It had simple lessons of right and wrong, you know. I just loved the dog of Davy. And having grown up Jewish, I don't know how, my parents clearly did not have parental controls on my TV doing this. And I have to say, when I looked this up, talk about how society has changed. If you go on the internet and search for this, there are all of these sort of mockeries of this with Davy killing people and everything. So it's really how our society has changed a little bit. But prior to television, I did hear there was once this thing called books and magazines, actually. And when I was young, I used to always love to go to my doctor's office and dentist's office, and I would always get highlight magazines, right? And I'd follow the stories of Goofus and Gowan. Here, Goofus, it says, Goofus bosses his friends. Gowan asks, what do you want to do next? So it's nice to believe that life is so simple that way, but that was how actually sometimes people learn lessons of good and bad. But lastly, and I think for most of history, right, we have storytelling that has happened to pass along ethical and moral stories. Obviously, prior to printing for the masses, this was a predominant way that wisdom was passed along from generation to generation. And one of the very common ways of sharing this was a parable. It's a short story meant to give a message. And we often think of parables only in regard to the Christian scriptures, the parables of Jesus, but parables are really as ancient as humanity. We have parables that are attributed to the Buddha in many of his writings, and as well the Hebrew scriptures themselves are filled with parables. So therefore it should not be surprising that Jesus used parables as a way of teaching. Actually, I have to tell you, I love the parables of Jesus, and I'll be leading an adult RE class starting later this winter on the parables. Now, one of the unique things about the parables in the Christian scriptures is that they have been written with hidden meanings. Jesus states, and I quote in the scripture, "To you it has been given to know the mysteries of the universe. To others I speak in parables, so that looking they may not perceive, and listening they may not understand." End quote. He tells this to his disciples. And I have to say, Jesus does not think very highly of his disciples, particularly in the Gospel of Mark, complaining to them that do you not understand these parables I tell you? And he's always having to explain the parables to them. And it seems in the later Gospels they seem to get smarter as time went on. But these parables are not just made to teach. I think that's why they're not always so obvious. They are also made to challenge us individually and challenge conventional wisdom. Even today, thousands of years later, or maybe because it's thousands of years later, we still do not really understand the parables, and we each tend to have our own interpretation of them. In some respects, that's okay if we're looking at it in the way of our life today, but looking back on it in how Jesus meant to use them, I would say it's not always the best way to do it. In my previous career, I worked for someone who was a devout Christian, and I have to say, it is a funny thing that when I told people I was going into seminary, people would always, for some reason, try to show me or tell me how smart they were about the Bible or what good Christians they were. And it wasn't worth going into what Unitarian Universalism was with them. But this one gentleman was just so proud of the fact that he paid his fair share of taxes because the Bible told him he should. And then he started actually quoting scripture to me. Fortunately, I had already taken my Christian scripture class in seminary. But he quoted from Mark chapter 12, verse 13, when Jesus is asked whether it is lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, and Jesus, holding up a coin with a picture of Caesar's on it, responds. And he says, and I quote, "Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and give to God the things that are God's." Now, for millennium, Christians have taken this statement to mean that they should dutifully pay their taxes in whatever country they are in and to abide by local laws. And I think this brings up actually a very important point in regard to the Christian scriptures in general and the parables in particular. First and foremost is that context is everything. You know, we tend to look back on the parables in the Christian scriptures with Christian theology in mind, or even with the gospel writer's own bias and interpretation. But I think it is important to understand the parable in the context in which it was originally told. It was told by Jesus, a Jewish teacher, to a Jewish audience. It was told at a time when Rome had invaded Palestine and pitted Jew against Jew. Many Jews had assimilated in the Greco-Roman Empire culture, and others were collaborators with the Romans as a way to survive. But the majority of people, though, were suffering under the yoke of oppression. And this taxation story is in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, and they all start with the Jewish leadership trying to, and I quote, entangle, entrap, or deliver Jesus up to the authorities. So therefore, there must have been some expectation that Jesus believed in tax resistance in Rome, to Rome, but they needed him to publicly state it to get him arrested. I think it also is supported by Luke chapter 23, verse 2, where upon handing Jesus to Pilate, the assembly says, and I quote, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor." End quote. Now, in the time of Jesus, many tax collectors over-collected taxes so as to make a profit. And it's put even a heavier burden on the largely poor agricultural population of Jerusalem. Often people had to mortgage their lands, and upon ever-rising taxes were often lost their lands. And in the time of Jesus, and eventually they would lose their land to money lenders or other powers that be. And in the time of Jesus, there was a very strong sense that God had given them this land, to the Jewish people. That land was God's, and that it was not to be transferred to Romans or to be used to facilitate payment to Romans. And Jesus here was trying to figure out a way to give his tax resistance message to the people to maintain his integrity, but without publicly denouncing the Romans, which would lead to his arrest. And his wording is highly ambiguous just for that reason. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Right? He doesn't say what is Caesar's, right? So what he's saying is render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, which is nothing. Render unto God what is God's. Everything, particularly the land. Right, so it's all in context. I have to tell you, I was really tempted not to give this interpretation to the owner of my company, because I just knew it would give him justification to cheat on his taxes, honestly. But I think that is the second important lesson, actually, about context. What meaning this had to the Jewish people 2,000 years ago is not the same meaning it has to us in America today. Although I think this thought process actually probably echoed through our American Revolution, where they talk about no taxation without representation. So I think that is that same stream of thought. But today, we have not been invaded by a foreign military requiring us to pay excessive taxes that are being used for the purposes of oppressing us and stealing our land. But I do think it is important that we understand the parable's original intent. And then we have to ask ourselves how that can have meaning to us today. What message is there in it in this time, in this culture? And so I'd like to share with you a few other parables, the lost parables of Jesus. Now these are three parables: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son. In each story, the protagonist has lost something. The shepherd has lost one of his 100 sheep. A woman has lost one of her 10 sons, one of her 10 coins, and the father has lost one of his sons. I have to admit, of course I looked into it because I've always struggled with these parables, particularly the one about the sheep. From Luke chapter 15. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them a parable. "Which person among you, having 100 sheep and losing one out of them, will not leave behind the other 99 in the wilderness and go after the lost one until you find it? And finding it, he puts it on his shoulders, rejoicing, and coming into the house, he calls together the friends and neighbors and tells them, 'Let us rejoice. Rejoice with me, because I have found my sheep, the lost one.'" End quote. So perhaps I struggle with the sheep parable because it is really alien to my experience. I really know nothing about sheep. But it's true. But I mean, I know about the coins, right? I know about from family relationships. I just can't relate to the sheep. But more so, I think it's because there were 100 of them. When you have 10 coins or 2 sons, I think it's easy to keep track of them, right? But I'm thinking it must be pretty hard to keep track of 100 sheep. I mean, do you do a count every 2 hours? I mean, I haven't talked to any shepherds about this, but, you can't just tell them to count off, like we do with the kids, to make sure we haven't lost one of the kids when we go on a field trip, count off, 1, 2, 3, 4. But, even if you realize, right, you lost one, going after it you'd think you're bound to lose all the others, honestly, if you chase the one that got away, right? Of course, raises the question of the utilitarian benefit of the 99 versus the life of that one sheep. I think of the oft-used aphorism in my household growing up, better 99 guilty people go free than one innocent person be arrested and go to jail. And so it made me think about that in relation to the sheep story. So maybe sometimes you have to sacrifice something to maintain a higher threshold of justice. Maybe that was a message that Jesus was trying to portray. Now, of course, Christian standard theology imagines the lost sheep as a sinner who has been redeemed and the shepherd as Jesus. But I don't think that was Jesus' intent in telling the story, honestly. Sometimes, I think as Sigmund Freud might say, sometimes a shepherd is just a shepherd, okay? It doesn't have to be an allegory for something else, right? Certainly, Jesus' first century audience would have understood a shepherd's story, right? There were many shepherds in the fields in those days. So what I think is happening here is Jesus is rebuking the leaders of the community for not keeping an eye on things. See, all 3 stories are about somebody who was responsible for something and they lost it. And I think Jesus was rebuking them for not allowing people, or for allowing the people to lose their lands. He was rebuking them for not caring for those in community in need. He's telling them they need to go and take care of those who have been hurt by the Romans and by their fellow Jews. I mean, how long did it take the shepherd to realize the sheep was lost? Was he playing games on his iPhone? Was he texting his fellow shepherds, the latest Maccabee singing group hit? Or was he just sleeping in the field instead of paying attention to and caring for his sheep? It's interesting when you switch the perspective from the focus on the sheep to the focus on the shepherd. And upon finding what was lost, the shepherd was overjoyed, it says. And I think what Jesus here is telling them is that there will be joy for all if justice is done. And the shepherd, when he finds it, he tells everybody publicly. He said, look, I lost this. I made a mistake. And here now, I recognize my mistake. I admit my mistake. And I am joyful about that. Now, I am taking responsibility for my failings. And I would like to say to all of us, we are all shepherds. And so I ask you to consider what or who you are not paying attention to. Are you paying attention to yourself, first of all, to your mind, your body, your spirit? Who have you not seen for a while in your life? Who have you not seen at services here in a while? Who needs your help? Let us pay attention to what and who is missing in our lives. I encourage you to write that card, to make that call, to take that visit, even if you're tired or you have one more meeting to go to search for what or who is missing. Just as in the story of the lost coin, not a light to a lamp or to sweep a house, forgetting all other responsibilities until you have found what it is you have lost. And it makes a difference to those who are lost, for perhaps they believe no one is even looking for them anymore. But it's not always so simple. It's not always so simple to even know what is lost. I think of the story of the prodigal son. The story of the son who left, took his share of the money, partied, went broke, and then comes crawling back to his father, and is welcomed back by his father, much to the chagrin of the older brother who stayed behind. Now we assume the one that is lost in this story is the son who went away, lost all his money, and then came back. But I think perhaps the lost son is the one who stayed behind. Perhaps the father has lost the love and the respect of his oldest son who was loyal to him. And so I ask you to consider what relationships are broken in your life. What relationships may be broken even in this congregation? Or better yet, let this story be a warning to us, to pay attention, to think about who it is that we just take for granted in our lives, for us to take stock of what relationships are meaningful to us, and to think about what actions we can make to make sure that those relationships stay strong. And for those that are lost, there is no need to hide. Come in from the wilderness. Come to the light of day. Forgive the errors and shortcomings of others. For you too have a part to play in reconciling relationships that need to be made whole. Let us expand our search and our reconciliations to beyond just our friends and our congregation. Who are the lost ones in our larger community? Who are the people who have wandered off, who do not have a safety net, who do not have support? And the Bible speaks to this also. Welcome the alien, feed the hungry, house the homeless, care for the orphan and the widow, visit the prisoner. Let us all pay attention let us all care. Let us all take responsibility. Responsibility for ourselves, for each other, for this congregation, and for the larger community. It seems like a lot, I know, but we are truly an amazing and capable species. And I think that is what Jesus was trying to get at. That we are capable of greatness as humanity. We are capable of great compassion and empathy for others. Now, Jesus spoke in parables often out of fear, but I encourage you to be fearless. Let us not wallow in the mud of pettiness and darkness, of idleness, but rather let us wake up and work together. Work together and pay attention to others. And by doing so, we can make our lives and the world whole. So let us continue to tell our stories and parables, because there is good in the world, and it is worth fighting for. May it be so.